So I think we'll start today's guest seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, there's many new faces here. Just to remind you, this is an Oxford Centre for Tropical Forests seminar, and during term time we tend to have a Friday seminar almost every week of the term, for this term and next term. And if you want to know more about it and not on the mailing list, there's a drinks reception afterwards, and there's the various leaflets there that they give you the web link and everything. So do pick out one of those leaflets, and you can join that. And next week we have a seminar on Friday, which is not tropical, but it's jointly with the Biodiversity Network, and that's going to be at the Natural History Museum, and it's Nikita Zimov talking about Pleistocene Park and the rewilding of the high Arctic with large animals. So that's at the Natural History Museum at 6 o'clock next Friday, and that almost certainly will be full, so do register online and sign up if you're interested in going to that event. Okay, so we'll kick off today. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tony. Tony is a well-known campaigner and writer, sustainability advisor over the last few decades. He began his career as an ornithologist working for BirdLife International, and then he began working for Friends of the Earth, eventually becoming executive director of Friends of the Earth UK, and also vice chair of Friends of the Earth International. Now, as of January 2018, he's the executive director for Advocacy and Campaigns at WWF-UK. So, Tony, thank you very much and welcome. And afterwards, we'll have about 20 minutes of questions, and then we have a drinks reception at the Gottman room just around the corner. So do link up for that.
All set. Dim the lights a little bit.
Good.
Thank you very much, Yadvinder. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon at the Oxford Centre for Tropical Forests to talk about tropical forests, and specifically to discuss really three headings. One is the state of the tropical rainforest today and the reasons for their changing status, what can be done to conserve them, and what we might do to achieve more in the future. And what I thought I'd do is really draw some ideas that came from this book, which was published earlier this year, Rainforest, Dispatches from Earth's Most Vital Frontlines. And this is really an attempt to try and capture some of the learnings that have emerged over the decades as to the character and the ecology of these systems, and to add to that some first-hand experiences and really eyewitness accounts of what I've seen, both in relation to what the problem is and also in terms of what the solutions might look like. Yadvinder mentioned some of the things I've done over the years. I've personally been involved in this particular struggle for quite a long time, as this picture proves, and goes back a very long time to my days as a naturalist, and then working at BirdLife International, and then from there in the late 1980s moving to Friends of the Earth and working on this subject for a long period there before becoming an advisor to the Prince of Wales's Rainforest project and working with the International Sustainability Unit that His Royal Highness set up to deal with some of these complex challenges, and then more recently joining WWF literally this year. And so really what I'm going to try to do is weave together a few thoughts that really accumulate from all of those different experiences, and indeed many others. So the state of the tropical forests and the pressures that are ranged against them. Well, certainly when I began my career, there was a lot of talk about logging and illegal logging. And so some of the tree species that live in the tropical rainforests are incredibly valuable in global markets for timber. And for that reason, these ecosystems have been more or less exploited over the decades and centuries indeed, in order to extract these very valuable materials. And sometimes this leads to people breaking the law. This is a piece of logging infrastructure in an area of primary forest in Jambi province in Sumatra that I photographed a couple of years ago. And this piece of forest had been invaded by loggers who were taking out the large trees. They hauled in chainsaws and made a rudimentary logging and milling camp. You could see where they were cutting planks to be shipped out by boat, and they were targeting the most valuable trees. And the effects of this, of course, on the ecosystem, in addition to the disturbance of the vegetation, causes animals to change their behaviour and has a range of some subtle and some quite dramatic ecological effects. And pretty much all areas of the tropical rainforests across the globe have been affected by logging in different ways, and it remains a major issue. Also, during the 80s and 90s, when I was becoming familiar with some of these questions, there was a big emphasis on shifting cultivation and the extent to which the forests were under pressure from small-scale agriculture, people seeking to make a living in and around the forests, people very often outside the market economy, certainly outside the global market economy, who were engaged in different kinds of low-level agricultural practices, which, if it was happening at quite low density, could be regarded as more or less sustainable. And indeed, where it was indigenous groups, and this is an indigenous tribe that is responsible for this bit of shifting cultivation in the Western Amazon, so long as that was undertaken in a way where there wasn't too much of it, the forest would regenerate, and it was more or less regarded as a sustainable activity. But when the population increases, not only because of the natural increase in populations, but also because of migrations, some of them planned by governments to move people to new territory in order to enable them to make a living, then the pressure can increase. And population growth at the edge of the forests, for whatever reason, can have other impacts. This is a photograph I took in Ivory Coast a couple of years ago of young women and women collecting fuel to cook with. There is no alternative there. Very poor people who can't afford to buy canisters of natural gas and who are forced, therefore, to use wood. And the wood is being collected from areas of secondary and indeed primary forest. And of course, this has an impact on the state of the ecosystem and the extent to which the forests can regenerate. So these local pressures, whether they be small-scale logging, whether it's small-scale agriculture or collection of fuel wood, they can be more or less impactful depending on the density of the people and the intensity of the activities that they're engaged with. But over time, and certainly during my time in the conservation world, there has been quite a big change in where the emphasis and the attention is now being taken, because what were previously quite local and often small-scale activities have now been augmented by activities which are at a much larger scale and not so much about the local community, but much more about the global community. This is the effects of a soybean plantation butting up against an area of forest in Mato Grosso in southwestern Brazil. You can see that unlike the shifting cultivation or a little bit of low-level logging, this is a completely different order of impact. The forest has been basically replaced by agriculture, and that agriculture is not feeding local populations, it's feeding the global market. And in this case, the soybeans are being put into supply chains, some of which are going to human consumption, of course, but most of which, about 75% of the soy, is being used to feed industrial livestock cultivation, particularly pigs and chickens all over the world, with massive growth markets in China and other parts of Asia where middle-class diets are now becoming more the norm. So a big market demand signal being sent into what were once remote areas of tropical forest. And the same can be said in terms of global demand for vegetable oil. This is the fruits of the West African oil palm. This tree is native to West Africa and has now been transported to pretty much all of the moist tropics, with massive expansion recently undertaken in Indonesia and Malaysia, where most of the world production of this oil is now located. And oil palm is a crop which is very lucrative. It's very high productivity. If you want to grow vegetable oil, this is a good vegetable oil. You can get more per hectare out of this than you can from oilseed rape, for example, that we grow in this country. The trouble is, much of the expansion of oil palm during recent decades has been at the expense of the tropical rainforest. It is a tropical rainforest plant, and the places where you can grow it is where the forest once was. This is in Borneo. This is a planned expansion of the oil palm coverage in that country, and this is being backed by government and obviously being incentivized by huge global demand for that kind of material. This photograph I took out the window of a helicopter in Riau province in Sumatra, and this is an illegal oil palm plantation. That one I just showed you was state sanctioned, planned and under the control of a major global company. This one is in a national park called Teso Nilo. This is an area of rainforest, unusually biologically diverse, one of the last areas in the lowland part of central Sumatra, absolutely stuffed full of endemic birds and mammals and of huge biological importance. But you can see on the ground where the trees have been cut and burnt, lying higgledy-piggledy all across the ground there. That was, it had been logged, that forest, but it was still in pretty good shape, but has now been replaced, as you can see, by these very dense ranks of oil palms that have been put in there. This is illegal, but as you can see, it is by no means unprofessional and not unorganized. This is a major piece of planting that's taken place, and of course is something which required some planning. And this stuff is getting into the global market too. It's being mixed up with other oil palm to be blended and to be sold into global markets. Of course, it's not just the production of vegetable oil for food that is driving this kind of expansion. This material is also being used in biofuel, as indeed is some of the soya beans that are being grown globally, both to act as a replacement for diesel. And bio gives the impression of green, but under no circumstances can you consider this as a sustainable alternative to fossil fuels. And of course, the extraction of non-food products from areas that were once covered with tropical rainforests is not only down to biofuel, but also to other commodities, including paper and pulp. This is an area of, again, in central Sumatra, quite near to Teso Nilo, where you can see in parallel to the expansion of oil palm, both illegal and legal, you can see this huge growth in the area under exotic species, including acacia and eucalyptus, very fast growing trees that are being put into this very moist, warm, tropical landscape, grow very quickly, and then to be fed into pulp and paper mills to supply the world's demand for that, and indeed packaging, card, and everything else. And so these kinds of upscalings of connections into the global market, whether it's for soy, palm, logs, paper, and everything else, of course, is being facilitated by the expansion of infrastructure. And this is a port in the city of Santarém in Brazil, where the confluence of the Amazon with one of its major tributaries leads to there being a very strategic location for getting soya out of the Amazon basin and into the market. Greenpeace actually did an action to block the opening of this particular facility because of the way in which it would send a pulse of demand into the remaining forested landscape in order to get more of this stuff into the global market. And of course, that infrastructure is connected to the remote forest frontier by other infrastructure, namely roads. And this one is being constructed into an area of primary forest, and we know what the effect of this is over time. One little example, well, one big example actually, is the infamous BR-364, a road that was put into the Western Amazon and which was upgraded with World Bank assistance, became a really great cause célèbre amongst the environmentalists during the 1980s. This is a picture of that road in the early 1980s. You can see it running, this is Rondonia in Brazil. You can see an area of pretty much unbroken forest with a road running into it. By the late 1980s, the effect of that road upgrade was that. And by the time we reached 2000, it looked like that. So this is a really predictable set of outcomes that follow the global demand being connected with the remaining forests by infrastructure. And indeed, one remarkable statistic I came across the other day was an estimate that since 2000 on planet Earth, we had installed another 12 million kilometres of road since the turn of this century. That's enough to go around the world a couple of hundred times, apparently. And we know that when roads are put into forests, it causes there to be the investment of time and effort to clear land in order to extract materials and grow crops. And indeed, in the Amazon, this place where that picture was taken from a satellite, 95% of the deforestation over recent decades has occurred within 5 kilometres of a road. So this is big. So a road might look like it's taking a little bit of forest in terms of the great expanse of trees that are there, but actually it facilitates everything that follows. And when you look at the numbers in terms of so many millions of hectares cleared since whatever baseline year you care to have in mind, bear in mind it's not just the it's not just the total amount of land that is the question that one needs to think through. It's also the fragmentation of the forest. On here you can see what were once areas of intact forest linked to others being progressively fragmented. This is again in Indonesia. This is an area of semi-natural forest. This is an area of acacia and eucalyptus. And that forest edge has really quite profound impacts on the ecosystem, causing drying effects to go in, causing light to go in, changing the character of the forest. And the smaller the fragment, the more profound the effect on the remaining wildlife. And indeed, globally now, according to scientists who've analysed some of this satellite information we now have, there are something like 50 million individual fragments of tropical rainforest. Years ago, there were a relatively small number of large chunks. There are now 50 million pieces with many tens of millions of kilometres of edge, thereby changing the character of the forest in those areas that remain. The reason for all of this, in terms of that progressive clearance of the forest in order to enable the extraction of resources and make way for commodities, is of course economic development. And whether that's economic development for families, for states, for companies, or for countries, the effect has been to turn natural wealth into financial wealth. That's basically what's been going on. This is Jakarta. I first went there in 1993. It looked then like a very developing country. Lots of low rise, lots of people living in pretty poor conditions around the edge of a pretty poorly developed central business district. This place now, there's a shopping mall down the side of the street there, makes Bond Street look a bit shabby and backward from the point of view of the consumer experience. This is basically an example of nature being turned into consumerism, I guess you could say, in terms of how countries have developed their economies over a period of time, seeing the natural resource base as the principal means to go from A to B. We did it here, of course, 200 years ago. The process continues now in many developing nations. And the effect of all of this, as far as the Asian region is concerned, pretty crude map, and it doesn't tell you all those little bits of 2, 5, 10 square kilometre pieces that remain. This just gives you an impression of where the big bits are left following several centuries of deforestation as a result of the pressures I just described. And you will see across the Asian region, there's some decent forest left here and up in here in Myanmar. There's a few bits of decent forest left in Sumatra. This is the loser landscape up here, Leuser. This is the last place on planet Earth where you can find orangutan, forest rhinoceros, tiger and elephant together as a guild of large mammals still living in one place together. That's the last place where that occurs. An incredibly important conservation priority right there. You can see areas of remaining forest across the island of New Guinea. We're still discovering new species. Every time somebody goes there, we discover new birds and mammals. An incredibly rich part of planet Earth. And of course, with more languages, human languages per square kilometre than anywhere else. And then in the centre of Borneo, a large chunk of forest still remaining. Western Gap forest largely gone, as are much of those in Sumatra, notwithstanding some remaining protected areas and fragments that are hugely important, but in the greater scheme of things, hugely depleted. Same can be said about the forests of West Africa. There's the Thai Forest National Park, a real gem. Tool-using chimpanzees, forest antelopes, a rare antelope called the zebra duiker living in there. There are elephants, an endemic bird called the white-necked picathartes, hugely important, but now massively isolated, as most of the forests in the Upper Guinea region, this area over here, have mostly gone, heavily fragmented, not least because of heavy development of cocoa production. And then the forests in the Lower Guinea and the Central African region, still very substantial chunks of forest remaining in Gabon, Congo, and in the DRC in particular. But you can see that forest beginning to fragment and shatter as roads are being driven in, more pressure from more people looking for land to grow food, big population pressures in Africa as well, with very large-scale population growth expected during the course of this century. And then in Central and South America, the largest block of remaining forest in the tropical moist region, of course, across the Amazon, but less talked about forests, but of huge biological importance in the so-called Atlantic forest region of Brazil. Many endemic species still to be found there. And then some incredibly rich forests remaining in some landscapes in Central America, although most of those in the Caribbean islands cleared in the period after the arrival of Europeans. And indeed, by the time of the French Revolution, most of the forests in this part of the world and this part of the world had already gone, as indeed as they had down there. So we've made quite an impact, but if you look at the total amount, there's still about half left. So for that remaining half, what might we do to be able to hopefully slow the loss of the rainforest, but also to begin to restore some? What kinds of approaches might we take? Well, one thing that the world has tried a lot is to identify important areas and to protect them. This has been a tried and tested route of conservationists. My colleagues in WWF over many decades have been trying to do more of this with more or less success. Basically, the idea is to identify and map and gazette and then to find ways to manage remaining areas of good forest. This is really about implementation, of course. This is the edge of the Thai Forest National Park in Ivory Coast. I visited there with some park guards during the course of writing Rainforest and was told of some of the challenges that exist in this particular geography. Very small resources being deployed by the park guards. They were barely even paid, but they still turned up to work to try and hang on to this incredible gem as biological treasure, which is now unique in West Africa. It's about the size of Norfolk. It's the largest bit of forest left, and it is globally important, and they know it, but they need to be able to manage this incredible pressure of encroachment around the edge. Huge population growth in Ivory Coast over the last years, since 1960 when the country became independent, and the country has been basically dependent on agricultural exports, mostly cocoa. And this is the reason why there's so little forest left, is because the land has been turned to agriculture. And with a rising population, more people need more land in order to be able to make some money. And so apart from the collection of fuel wood and people going in there to hunt meat, the forest guards with small resources are trying to prevent the encroachment in to get cocoa estates growing in there. They've been quite successful at this so far, and hopefully the global community will continue to help countries like Ivory Coast with the protection of these incredibly important remaining areas of forest. This, though, it's become clear, and it was clear quite early on as this strategy for more protected areas was being developed, will be insufficient on its own. It is literally going to be impossible to hold the line on a sufficiently large scale to stop the extinction of forest wildlife that's now gathering such pace. it will be important to address the drivers, the sources of demand of deforestation at the same time. And indeed, this is what my colleagues and I at Friends of the Earth did quite a lot of, and indeed with some success. This is a campaign we launched in 1992, marking the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. And this was basically drawing attention to a brutal trade in a very valuable wood that was wiping out indigenous communities on the other side of the world to Europe, where we were campaigning. I'd been to meet with various indigenous and other campaigners in Brazil, and they told us that the mahogany business was one of the reasons why diseases were still being taken into deep forest areas. There were conflicts going on between indigenous communities and the loggers, and this stuff was coming across even to prestigious shops like Harrods, and very often, the shops wouldn't know, there was literally a linkage back to human rights conflicts in the edge of the forest. And so we launched a campaign to do something about this, and we called the campaign Mahogany is Murder, because we could link the industry with the death of indigenous communities. And we then set about a consumer boycott of this wood, basically to remove it from the UK until people could show that it was being legally and sustainably produced. That didn't seem to be an unreasonable demand, really. Is it legal? Is it sustainable? And this led to the most almighty argument, as you could imagine. And over the course of the coming years, we tried to internationalize the campaign. We took it to the United States. Our colleagues in the Rainforest Action Network joined in, and we did, over a period of time, actually quite a short period of time, reduce mahogany imports into the UK by 80%, and shortly after did the same in the United States. This, you can imagine, sent a very powerful political and financial and economic signal back into Brazil and other exporting countries, to the point where they did begin to crack down. It did actually have an impact, and one that began to change the policy in those exporting countries, at least to begin with. Then we had the campaign spreading not only from particular timbers, but also to big-scale resource flows, including pulp and paper coming from Indonesia. This is a Greenpeace action. It's rather a good one, I thought, made me laugh anyway. This is the headquarters of Mattel in Los Angeles. This is a company that was buying paper from Asia, pulp and paper, a company that was responsible for large-scale deforestation, converting natural forest to pulp and paper plantations in Sumatra and Borneo. And Greenpeace in this case, and it was a Friends of the Earth campaign before this, basically we said this is not a good way to conduct a business. It's not a responsible business, and you shouldn't be using tropical rainforest wood to make paper. And that's basically what was going on. They were taking the Dipterocarp forest, most of it had already been logged, but it still had tigers, it still had elephants, some of it even had orangutans. They were taking that and they were putting tropical rainforest into their pulp mills and then planting eucalyptus and acacia in the areas that had been cleared. And so this was another example of market pressure, trying to get to the drivers, the demand for the products that were causing the problem. And in this case, a spectacular piece of work from Greenpeace that targeted more than 100 global consumer brands. This is Mattel. They went to speak to Walmart, to Xerox, to Staples, to Tesco, to Nestle, and one after the other, all of these companies said, actually, you've got a point. If there's a question of deforestation linked to our Kit Kat or our children's writing pads, we really don't need that. And what we're going to do, therefore, is switch to suppliers who can tell us about their supply chain. They can tell us that it's sustainable and legal, and we're going to have that paper instead. And this sent a shockwave through Asia Pulp and Paper, who in February 2013 said that they were going to stop their bulldozers and not cut any more natural forest. This was really quite a result. And actually, by this time, I was working in an advisory capacity with some colleagues who had set up an advisory environmental group, and we began working with Asia Pulp and Paper to implement this new plan. So Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, over a period of getting on for 20 years, had really kind of made the case for the switch, and then the switch occurred, and then we began to work with Asia Pulp and Paper to implement that particular new policy. And I was just saying to Yadvinder, just as we were coming into the room earlier on, about some of the complexity that followed in the wake of this, in terms of the governance and the government role in Indonesia, and the extent to which there were even decent maps describing who had the right to do what. But even under those difficult circumstances, progress was made. The bulldozers were removed from the native areas of forest, and a couple of years later, and in fact announced in 2015 at the Paris Summit on Climate Change, Asia Pulp and Paper announced its policy to restore 1 million hectares of tropical rainforest in landscapes where they were producing pulp and paper. So that came from a consumer campaign. The deforestation was stopped, and then a commitment was made for 1 million hectares of restoration, and this was really down to a very clever way of connecting consumers in the West to deforestation on the other side of the world. All of these things targeting particular types of timber, whether it's mahogany, or targeting the companies that were involved in particular resource flows. And actually another one's on the agenda at the moment, isn't it? With this orangutan advert causing a big controversy. Have you all heard about that? With Iceland Foods and people being alerted to the dangers of palm oil production. This has then driven a lot of interest in this idea of certification. So if we are going to believe that we're actually getting legal and sustainable stuff, getting individual companies to say that they will do that, that's a good step. But in terms of how we scale up that particular source of consumer goods and materials, well, certification became one way in which the world has responded. This is the logo of the Forest Stewardship Council. I would say that one of the reasons why this was set up was that mahogany campaign I showed you a moment ago. Some of the companies that were being targeted by Friends of the Earth and others in relation to mahogany were around the table discussing with WWF how it might be possible to come up with some credible scheme that people could believe that would identify wood that was good compared with that wasn't. And since then, we've had other certification schemes arise. One that's been in the news because of that advert on orangutans is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, which only last week adopted a new, tougher standard to identify good palm oil coming into the market. So this is a complex and difficult and quite controversial area, but I think no matter how cynical you are about certification, I think it marks progress that people actually now are willing to identify, if they can, the kinds of products that hopefully can command some kind of consumer confidence. As, however, we were running all of these campaigns during the 1990s, there was a parallel discussion emerging, and it was one that led to a deeper analysis about the drivers. So the market is one thing, better market information, but actually there are other things that were in play then as they are today, which actually were really quite important issues. How can you conserve natural ecosystems if you're going to liberalize the global trade system in order that people can move materials and resources around, and actually the environment and the regulations to protect the environment are being systematically dismantled? That was a big fear we had when we went to the World Trade Organization Summit in Seattle in November 1999 to be tear-gassed by the Washington State Police for pointing out that actually new trade rules of the kind that were being discussed there might endanger the forests into the future. Focus on GDP, we knew, was not only driving environmental degradation, but different kinds of inequality rather. And so campaigners began to target the global economic system more broadly in a search for solutions. Shortly after the protests in Seattle, that's me 2 minutes before my arrest by the Swiss police in Davos, where I was hoping to point out to the chief executives and the heads of state gathered there that actually they were investing in an economic idea that was causing environmental devastation. And actually looking back on that protest that took place in January 2001, it's really quite amazing to see what the World Economic Forum puts out now. Because even there, we have won some major shifts in opinion. It may not seem like it as we look at the environmental devastation going on, but in 2001, when we were doing that protest in Davos, nobody was talking about the environment. Climate change was something that was for the greenies. Probably it was wrong in many people's estimation there. And actually, even if it was right, the best way of dealing with it was to leave it to the market and probably consumers. If they wanted to have a more energy efficient light bulb, we'll give them a choice. That's as far as the discussion went in those days. As a result of these kinds of campaigns, however, going back over a few decades, the situation now has switched at least somewhat to the point now where quite a few of these big global brands can see a deeper economic rationale beyond consumer demand and the likes of the FSC for investing in the conservation and even the restoration of forests. And one reason they do that is because of security of supply. This is a community living in West Africa who are dependent on cocoa, and as a result of environmental degradation in that part of the world and the poverty that comes with the environmental degradation, fewer and fewer people wish to grow cocoa. If you are Nestle or Mars or Mondelez or some of these big brands that need to have a supply of cocoa in order to be able to continue to be in business, it makes sense for you to invest in the well-being of these people. And that's not only about giving them technical assistance and better crop varieties, but also thinking about ways in which you might be able to raise their incomes by giving them access to market in ways that's going to enable them to produce more from the land they've already got, and not therefore to have to encroach into places like the Thai forest I showed you a few moments ago. So as a result of this mind shift, whereby the environment used to be a bit of a distraction to the big global brands and decision makers, we are entering a period, and I use the present tense entering, a period where people are beginning to put two and two together and to see that the economics of this, it's not so straightforward. Destroy the environment or make money. No, actually, in order to make money, we have to protect the environment. That's the mindset that is beginning to get into this set of actors who are basically in business to make money, but are increasingly realizing that the forests are important if they want to do that. So what I've described in terms of some of the things that have occurred to take us in a better direction, the establishment of protected areas, getting more into understanding the sources of supply, and then beginning to think about the fundamentals of the economy. Another thing that has been hugely important, and I would say this is the most successful thing that's been done so far, is the empowerment of indigenous groups who are still living in areas of tropical forest. And this is a picture of a group of people in the Ashaninka tribe in Peru. I went to visit them to find out more about their history and their struggle. And amongst the many things I found out is that since these people have gained control through a change to Peruvian law, the deforestation in this area has gone down very rapidly. So there is still encroachment into the forest here, illegal logging, people growing cocaine to feed the global markets for that. There's a little bit of cocoa being grown illegally, bits of encroachment, but the deforestation rate inside the reserve that's controlled by these people is 1/20th of that outside. And the reason for that is they've got control of the place. And it's not simply that they've got control of the place. These people have a very different view of the world compared to the people who would like to cut the forest down. So these people have been living there for hundreds of years, and they regard the forest as being their source of well-being. They have a spiritual connection with it. They see it as something that provides all of their needs: fresh water, meat, fruit, building materials. And that's a very different view to the people who see it as a source of dollars linked to the extraction of mahogany or the clearance of land in order to gain access for soya beans or for beef cattle. This is a mindset change. But I wouldn't want you to think that the people living in these kinds of places, very remote from Western societies, are in any way unsophisticated. This is a fella called Jaime Penner. He is an indigenous leader in the Ashaninka group, and I visited him in his house deep in the forest, and with some solar panels and with some internet connection, computers, printers and cameras, he runs a very sophisticated science program to help the people working with him cool Earth to better protect the forest by gathering more information. So Jaime's out in the jungle, quite long trips he makes, several days in duration, to put camera traps into areas of remote forest. He showed me videos and pictures of jaguars, of ocelots, of spectacled bears, and these animals are living right next to the communities where he still lives, and he explained to me how what he needs to do is not only collect the data and share it with the scientists and to convince the Peruvian government of the importance of where he lives, but he's sharing this information with other indigenous groups in the region in order for them to understand the places where they live are incredibly special and worthy of protection. And he's doing that in order to inspire them to become more empowered like he and his colleagues are in order to defend the forest. This is politics, really, and about these people getting political control and being able then to protect the forest, because they want to do that because they have a completely different view of those who are outside. There are various maps you can see of the Brazilian Amazon, the Peruvian Amazon and the Colombian Amazon, and you can see through those maps how those areas where the indigenous people have control, that there has been a high level of success in being able to conserve the forest compared with those areas where there isn't indigenous control. Martin von Hildebrand, a great leader in Colombia who has done so much to conserve the tropical forests in that country, in large part through gaining legal control for the indigenous groups, says that it's a simple matter of the number of eyes that are there, people on the ground who live in the place who are watching what's going on. Sometimes there are conflicts, sometimes there's even loss of life, but the very fact that those people have a legal basis to be able to look after the place they live, their ancestral lands, makes a huge difference. So I think it's fair to say that we know that there are things that can work. Despite those pressures I described at the beginning, there are things that people are doing, whether it's consumer campaigns, whether it's protected areas, whether it's certification and setting standards for production, whether it is changes to the economics of how companies build their business models, or whether it's changes to the indigenous control. We know that we can make progress in slowing down the rate of forest loss. But what can be done to secure better outcomes into the future? What I want to say here, really, just to convey what I hope is quite a simple idea, and it's about changing the way we look at the forests, I think, is the most important thing that we need to do. Because we have the tools to do this, and the reason we still have deforestation is because we lack the political will, sometimes still, to do what is needed. And I think part of that changing of the narrative is really to make a simple point. Because if you look back at the history of all of this, very often you can see an assumption there that the loss of the forests somehow is the price of progress. Regrettable, but inevitable, because people need to make a living, we need land to grow food, and therefore we have to tolerate some level of forest loss. Well, actually, it's the opposite. We have to protect the forests in order to protect the future of humankind. That's the new narrative that now needs to be landed in order to change the political discourse. So what might that narrative be based upon? Well, water security, I think, is quite a fundamental global priority that's becoming more obvious each year, not least because of climate change, but also because of the effects of the damage to the hydrological cycles being caused by deforestation. So in this book, I spoke to various scientists who are looking at the mechanisms by which the tropical forests interact with moisture in the atmosphere. And I think it's fair to say that we have, until quite recently, massively underestimated the role of these ecosystems in global water security. They're pumping literally billions of tons of moisture into the atmosphere every day. and the way in which that moisture is turning from vapour and back into liquid in droplets in the high atmosphere is actually driving atmospheric circulation on a very large scale and is transporting water over very long distances. That stuff is now becoming more and more clear, and as we learn of the effects of droughts in different parts of the world, so climatologists and hydrologists are beginning to make connections between deforestation in one place and droughts in another. Perhaps one of the highest profile examples of that during recent times was the effect of the 2014 drought that affected southeastern Brazil, had a big impact on the economy. Some scientists were saying it was linked with deforestation in the Amazon, several thousand kilometers away, but nonetheless they could detect a connection, not least through the way in which they are able to measure the origin of water that's falling in rain. Water that's falling in rain coming from forests compared to coming from the ocean, it's possible to spot the difference between the two and therefore to establish some level of linkage. And that water that's falling from the sky, of course, runs in rivers. It's vital for irrigation in some geographies, of course, vital for public supply, and in some parts of the world, is vital also for hydroelectricity. I took this photograph in the cocoa landscapes in Ivory Coast, and this is a hydroelectric dam on the Subre River. This is being constructed by the Chinese state hydropower company, the Sasandra River at Subre, and this dam is in a geography that suffered from very high rates of deforestation. And whilst there and talking to the cocoa farmers, it became clear that they were living through an unprecedented drought. It hadn't rained for weeks, the rivers were at very low flow, and not only was this having an impact on the cocoa, I discovered, but also potentially an impact on this kind of infrastructure in the future. I asked the Chinese engineer in charge, I went and spoke to him. I said, has anyone done an environmental assessment looking long term to understand what the effects of deforestation will be on your $500 million dam? No. We hadn't thought of that. There is a clue in the name. It's called a rainforest for a reason. It makes it rain. And as a result of the rain, the rivers flow. If you clear the forest, what is the risk to a hydroelectric dam? The answer is huge. There's also huge risks to agriculture very far from the forests. I quote some authors in this book who've looked at the long distance transfer of water linked to tropical forests, and they say there is a direct connection with rainfall as far north as the Great Plains of North and South Dakota, and even Manitoba in Canada, one of the world's grain regions. Rain is falling there that's being put into the atmosphere by the forests in Central and South America. That's what they say their models show. So water security is going to be a 21st century issue with major ramifications, and not just in terms of water supply, but also for actual security. Countries potentially at conflict over access to water. One of the ways in which we can ensure we will have more secure water is to protect the water cycle, and the tropical rainforests are an important part of how that works. Another part of the narrative as to why we need to flip our perception, of course, is about genetics. Many of our food plants that we use to feed the world today are from tropical forests and tropical rainforests more specifically. That's coffee, cocoa, and of course the chicken. Just think where the profits of, for example, Starbucks and Costa would be had there not been some discovery of the importance of coffee beans rather, and people domesticating that centuries ago. Cocoa, another one, of course. Where would the profits of Nestle and Mondelez and Mars be had the Olmec Indians in Guatemala some thousands of years ago not understood that this particular plant's fruits had some quite important properties? Where would Kentucky Fried Chicken be without that tropical rainforest pheasant that evolved in the rainforests of Southeast Asia? Well, of course, none of them would be anywhere. And there's many other animals and plants that are important, not only for current food security, but future food security. You hear a lot about genetic engineering when people talk about the future of agriculture. Actually, there's a more important story about genetics, I would argue, and it's about the wild relatives of all of these and many other species that still live in the natural ecosystems, evolving, developing new survival solutions, new gene sequences, and those new gene sequences could be hugely important in the future as we deal with novel diseases, the effects of climate change, and other challenges. Plant breeders in Cambridge that I know, working with them recently and in a discussion about their work to try and breed higher yielding strains of wheat into the future, getting more wheat from the same land. And where are they going for their new genetic inspiration? They're going back to goat grasses that were one of the hybrid plants that formed wheat in the first place some 10,000 years ago. There are places in Central Asia where the wild relatives still live, and they're going there and they're sequencing the genes to see if they can find clues as to how they can improve modern wheat, going back to the ancestral relatives. So all that stuff is still out there so long as the forests are still there. And never mind what we've not discovered yet. And of course, the tropical rainforests are home to more than half of the species we know of on land, and is one of the reasons why this planet is presently heading towards a mass extinction. And that genetic heritage that's going with that mass extinction could have big costs for humankind. It could also cost us in relation to the future of medical treatments. This is a red-eyed tree frog. In the skin of that animal was discovered a compound that can prevent the multiplication of the virus that causes AIDS in humans. Quite an important molecule, isn't it? Occurred randomly in that animal. Well, not randomly, it was there by natural selection, but the fact that we found it there randomly and able to use it in medicine was down to the fact that that animal still exists. And then, of course, there's cancer cures, remedies for heart disease, painkillers, blood pressure remedies. All of these things have already been found in wild creatures, and many more will be discovered into the future, so long as they are still there. Maybe the story of the gastric brooding frogs should just concentrate our minds a moment. These tropical forest amphibians had evolved the means whereby they could swallow their eggs and the tadpoles would develop in the stomach of the adult amphibian. This was a very good survival trick because it would stop fish and birds eating your tadpoles. Scientists looked at this and thought, well, why aren't the tadpoles being digested by the gastric juices? And the reason was they had mastered some molecular trick to avoid being eaten up by powerful gastric enzymes. And the scientists thinking about this thought this could be a cure for peptic ulcers. We might discover some clues here about how we could treat a human disease. We couldn't look at that, however, because both of the species of gastric brooding frogs were rendered extinct by the destruction of their habitat. A cautionary tale, perhaps, one that we can't put an immediate value on, but the existence value beyond its intrinsic worth and the fact that the gastric brooding frogs should exist for their own reasons, we've actually sawn off a bit of the tree of life, which might in the end limit our prospects too. And as we enter a modern world of incredibly pressing challenges in engineering and design too, we may find many clues out there for breakthroughs that could help us hugely. This is a glass-winged butterfly. It's got a transparent wing, and that's to enable it to blend into foliage and to foil birds that might wish to eat it. And one of the reasons why this butterfly is successful is because of the coating on the wing means it doesn't reflect sunlight. It's got a coating, a nanoscale coating that prevents sunlight bouncing off, and people have copied that in order to make coatings for solar panels to stop the light bouncing off of those, and therefore to make them 10% more effective, which means you need 10% less land to generate the same amount of electricity. A little clue of design we learnt from a humble butterfly living in a Colombian cloud forest. And then, of course, there's the matter of carbon, one of the biggest pressing stories of all. Those big rainforest trees that are being targeted by the loggers, these hold most of the carbon in an area of forest, a tiny minority of the total number of trees, but with the biggest chunks of carbon held right there. Those are the ones that are being targeted. Maybe we should stop logging in tropical rainforests for reasons of climate change. We've just been told, again, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that the window for action now is extremely narrow. And if we are going to get through that extremely narrow window, we are not going to do it with solar panels alone. Despite the help of the glass-winged butterfly, we're going to have to invest in the conservation and restoration of ecosystems. And not only because of the vegetation being lost above ground, but also because of the huge carbon stores that exist below ground. This is a photograph I took in Jambi province in Indonesia just before the Paris summit on climate change. I was absolutely flabbergasted by this. That was an area of logged but still good forest 2 hours before that photograph was taken. And before the photo was taken, the ground level was there. This was peat, about 3 meters of peat. And when that fire went through there, not only did it destroy the vegetation above ground, it blasted all of that carbon that was below ground into the atmosphere. And those fires burnt on for months. And out of those peatland fires went into the atmosphere day by day, bigger carbon dioxide emissions than the entire United States, with all its factories, cars, aircraft, and houses. So there's another good reason, on top of the genetic heritage, the water security, for climatic stability, to have any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of global warming. This has to be stopped immediately. So what are we going to do? Well, we've had various discussions going back now over many years, and hopefully the penny is beginning to drop in terms of the carbon side, and also in terms of the climate resilience side. This is a Caribbean hurricane, Hurricane Matthew, going through the Caribbean region in the early part of October 2016. That killed thousands of people. And the reason it killed thousands of people is because it hit islands that were completely deforested, especially Haiti in the western side of Hispaniola. The effects of this were made much worse by 98% deforestation. So for reasons of the causes of climate change and reasons of adaptation, we might wish to invest more in the conservation of these systems. And indeed, we might be thinking more about the future sustainable economic development of many tropical countries in terms of their biggest asset, perhaps being their natural environment. On that side, you can see a picture of an area we visited in Costa Rica, where the forest is being put back in order to make a tourism facility. Up the back there is a cross-border park with Panama, one of the most important areas of remaining tropical rainforest in Central America. That place is being protected and expanded because it's bringing in millions of dollars every year in tourism revenue. People really want to go there and see these places. The Periyar Tiger Reserve, another one, this one in India, where people flock from all over the world to go and visit places where you've got a chance of seeing wild elephant and tigers, and the indigenous groups there are acting as the guides, bringing social benefits to otherwise quite hard-pressed communities. All of this, all of these economic and practical reasons, water, carbon, genetics, tourism, we're going to have a step up in the global machinery to be able to do what's needed. So this is the Bali Climate Summit in 2007, when the first discussions were going on about how the climate regime globally might be linked with the forest conservation ambitions that governments had. There's Ivo de Boer, Secretary General of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think that says it all, really, doesn't it, in terms of what was going on. And look at President SBY of Indonesia, doesn't look very happy. Ban Ki-moon thinks to himself, what are we going to do about all of this? But the politics continued, and 8 years later, we had that, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and built into it a piece of the agreement is around cooperation for the conservation and restoration of the tropical forests. And so the breakthroughs can be made, and indeed are being facilitated by very high-level bilateral contacts between governments, making the case that I've just described for the practical reasons as well as the ethical ones to get big steps forward. That's the Prince of Wales meeting with President Santos of Colombia a couple of years ago in the Amazon. They went to visit the extension to the Chiribiquete Reserve, where President Santos signed that day a declaration increasing the area that's protected by 1 million hectares. This is political will. That's political will right there. Somebody signing an order at the top of a government with the encouragement of the international community, in that case in the form of our own Prince of Wales, to be able to go to the next stages. And all of this stuff, when it comes to carbon, when it comes to water, when it comes to protected areas, we've now got new tools. Some years ago, people say, well, can you believe any of these people? Do you actually expect they'll do what they say they will do? Well, it's becoming increasingly hard to hide, because we have now near real-time monitoring platforms to tell us what's going on in the forest. And we have increasingly sophisticated tools that can help us begin to measure carbon. So the elements are beginning to align. We know more about the value of the forests. We know more about the political deals that can be done. And we've got the technology to underpin a new action plan for the future. And increasingly, we have a dialogue going on at the global level that tells us that we need to act right away, not only for the sake of nature, but for ourselves. This is the Secretary General of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, telling us we have to forge a new global accord. And indeed, this is at the heart of our work now at WWF, is a call for a new global deal for nature, something like the Paris Accord, but relating to biological systems, to the natural environment, and of course, to ecosystems like the tropical rainforests. The big political question is between now and October 2020, can such a deal be put in place? Because that's when the next major meeting of the United Nations Biodiversity Convention will take place in China. And this week and next week in Egypt, countries will be making preparations for that meeting. And that hopefully will be the moment when the world finally understands at a very high political level everything I've just told you about water security, climate change, and genetic resources. So the choice is ours. The choice is now. The opportunity to make the big step up is over the next couple of years. And I hope everybody here today would like to join in with the campaign to encourage governments to do what's needed. Thank you very much indeed.